So what makes a BMW a BMW? If you and I were drawing up a list, we'd have to include Freude am Fahren and, of course, M-cars. However, something arguably more important to the history of BMW and clearly more ubiquitous would be the inline six. Now granted, they didn't invent it, but they certainly perfected it, which begs the question. If a BMW can perform like it has a six, but rather than having a six, it kind of takes a cue from the folks at Toyota, would that still be considered a BMW? So there's a lot going on underneath the hood here. Some of it's familiar, some of it's not familiar. The familiar part, a 2-liter 4-cylinder turbocharged engine. That's 181 horsepower and has 258 pounds of torque that comes in at 1,850 RPM. That is in turn paired with an electric motor. The electric motor gets a bit more interesting because it's 107 horsepower, but 195 pound-feet of torque comes in as low as 100 RPM. But as we have learned in many hybrid episodes, you can't just add those numbers together and that's the total system horsepower. In this case, it's more respectable than a regular old 530 gas engine. It's 288 horsepower and 310 pound-feet of torque. But something that's interesting that comes along with this refresh of 5 Series, they kind of borrow a page out of the Porsche book where they have an overboost feature. And they call it Extra Boost, and you go into that mode in Sport mode, it adds an additional 40 horsepower for 10 seconds. Now there is the option to drive all of that power to the rear wheels only, which this car is, or all-wheel drive. In either case, it goes through the transmission you and I have become incredibly familiar with when it comes to BMWs, an 8-speed torque converter automatic. Now we do need to address the reason for being for this thing, and that would be the fuel economy. Just on the gas engine, it's pretty respectable, 26 mpg. However, in electric mode, it's 64 mpge. Then this is still a BMW, so we do need to discuss some of the performance figures. 0 to 60, somewhat respectable, 5.7 seconds. VMAX 130 miles an hour. However, with the right wheel and tire combination, that goes up to 146. So even with the second propulsion system and the raft of batteries, 4,220 pounds, or depending on you express your weights and measures, 1,914 kilograms. With that, a little bit of a delay there. Oh, but 3,000 RPM, man, it pulls all the way up to 6,500. This thing works very much harder than the regular 530. Now, the thing that you really notice here, it does feel like a 6-cylinder. That is indeed something that stands out about this combined propulsion system. Where it falls flat, it really falls flat perhaps as a bridge too far. It just doesn't sound the part of a 6-cylinder. You got the thrust, but when you really push it aggressively, it does sound like a 2-liter 4-cylinder. I get it here. This is just arriving at the same type of delivery of power, the same acceleration, a different way. And it's also aided by the 8-speed transmission. It works better here than in the regular 4-cylinder. Remember, we recently drove the 430 with the same engine here, really similar engine, not the same amount of tune. And there, it's not well matched to that 4-cylinder. Here, with the extra torque coming out of the electric motor, it works pretty well to the point where you can actually have a good time with a 4-cylinder and an electric motor in this size of a car. Now, if I put it into hybrid mode, it does change the personality of the vehicle. It's not as aggressive when you push it. It's definitely less acceleration. It feels like a hybrid in this mode. Not so much like a Toyota Prius, but definitely a hybrid. Being you and I have discussed the underpinnings of this generation of 5 Series in many previous episodes, we are not going to do the usual double wishbones in the front, multi-link in the rear circus. Rather, we need to focus on the architecture of an electrified 5 Series. And yes, that does impact the suspension, and the best example of that would be the optional M Sport package, which this car is fitted with. Now, on a normal ICE 530, that would change things like the wheels. They go from the standard 18s to the 19s you see here. Changes the steering. They call it a variable sport steering. What does that mean to you and I? It's more of a heavier weight steering. And yes, there are some cosmetic changes, but the biggest difference would be adjustable dampers. However, with the electrified 5 Series, the adjustable dampers are not on offer. Now, if I were taking a stab in the dark as to why the BMW engineers took that decision, I'd have to say it has something to do with the weight, because the car you are looking at with the 2 propulsion systems is 455 pounds more than an ICE 530. That is over 10% difference. It is more akin to an M550 xDrive. That means the V8 all-wheel drive, it's about the same weight. Now, an interesting PS to that, the all-wheel drive system in its entirety, whether it's in a V8, an inline 6, this hybrid, or just the box standard 530 with the gas engine, 101 pounds. So what makes up all that extra weight? Well, there's the obvious electric motor, and that sits between the gas engine and the transmission, kind of like the integrated starter generator motors we've experienced in those 48-volt Mercedes. However, this one is not 48-volt, the electrified one. Instead, the inline 6, that's 48-volt. We'll talk about that in a different episode. Then, of course, there has to be the battery. So where do they put the batteries? It sits underneath the back seats, and it's not entirely a very big battery. It's a 12 kilowatt hour battery. In terms of range out of that battery, it's 21 in this rear-wheel drive car we're driving today, 18 in all-wheel drive. How does it impact the packaging of the vehicle? The only thing I could tell, and I've spent some time in the back seat, is in the trunk. It changes the level of the load floor throughout the depth of the trunk, reason being a portion of the batteries and the temperature control module is packaged above the rear subframe. That raises the load floor of the trunk above the rear wheels. However, there's a neat packaging trick here. The parcel shelf can be adjusted up or down to give the trunk a bit more depth for storage. Okay, now that we understand all the extra hardware that's strapped to this thing and all the accompanying weight, the driving dynamics do have a bit of an impact. And the reason why is you do have a bit more pitch here. And what's aiding to the extra pitch is all that extra weight we talked about. My guess, it's not really the electric motor or all that other stuff, because there's good control over the squat and dive. The issue is the pitch, and it's probably the extra weight that comes from that raft of batteries. That combined with relatively good steering. It's direct, there's good feedback. Again, BMW is doing something with their steering that other German manufacturers really aren't. Like Mercedes, they're just too light. No matter what, even in an AMG, I've found them to be a bit too light. In BMWs, it's the right weighting, even a vehicle that's not trying to be an M car. And here, perhaps not a technical term, but it seems to be a bit floaty. There's a waft to the ride quality of this thing. And yeah, it probably has something to do with the second propulsion system, the extra weight of the batteries, but really that wrapped up in the longer wheelbase of a 5 Series, that's why it has a waft to it. Now, we'll give you a heads up before we get to the options game. This specific car that you and I are caning here is fitted with the M Sport brakes, meaning larger diameter rotors. All of the cars they send to Kumo and I have these larger brakes, and here they work incredibly well. I do have to scratch my head. Here's a car that's fitted with better brakes, but not better dampers. That's a bit strange to me. Either way, good feedback, good pedal modulation, and wonderful stopping power, especially when you consider this has to fight some extra weight because of all the stuff that's strapped to this car. Yes, it is indeed that time again to play your favorite game on the options game with today's contestant, a BMW that is thankfully not Amatrin Metallic, otherwise known as purple. This one, the 2021 BMW 530e rear-wheel drive, not all-wheel drive, hybrid for $57,200. To that, we add the color. Now, you guys know I am a sucker for blue, but this one, it ain't any old blue. This one is called, a very cool name, Phytonic Blue. As a Greek man, that almost sounds like some sort of like Greek god or Greek mountain where gods live, but I don't think it is. But Phytonic Blue, I would get it just for the name, and it's cheap, $550. To that, we add the ivory Napa leather interior. Really good color combination. Me, I would probably do a saddle. Either way, you're really paying for the leather rather than vinyl seats, $2,500. Then the driver's assistance package. This is the level 2 autonomy. No, this is not a self-driving car, but it will assist in traffic, $1,700. Then the Shadowline trim. This is like the AMG Night package. Black trim in different parts of the car, $500. Don't think I would do that. The luxury seating package. This is a big deal on a BMW. It adds more adjustments to the seats. Think of them as like the old school orthopedic seats from Mercedes back in the day, but more electric adjustments, $1,000. Then the M Sport package, we talked about that earlier, $2,500. The parking assistance package, I guess it's a city car, $800. The premium package, very important here. That would be the premium version of the Harman Kardon sound system, the power open and close trunk, the gesture control, the heated seats, and most importantly, the head-up display for $1,850. The M Sport brakes, which are well worth it, and we discussed them earlier, $650. And then you were gonna call me a wimp about this because I live in California, but I love me a heated steering wheel. I would say that is $190 well spent. Then the only other thing we have to add is the destination from Dingelfing, Deutschland, $995, for a total retail price of $70,485. So you may not have been aware of this, but throughout this entire episode, you and I have been banking electrons in that battery back there. Thus, it is high time for us to spend our allowance. Electric mode, and let's try acceleration. Now here, a couple of notes. Number one, can't go full taps. The minute you put your foot to the floor, the car goes back into hybrid mode, which would defeat the purpose of an acceleration test in electric. Now, if I'm being completely honest, this mode is mainly for around town. Yeah, you could use it here. The acceleration is good, it's moderate. And then there's the transmission. So if I wanna shift the gears like we were doing before to drive it aggressively, the minute you go into manual mode, it does switch over into hybrid. Moving to the brakes, here it picks up from the M Sport brakes that we talked about. There is no like on-off switch feel to the pedal that plagues most hybrids and EVs. And this is where I would argue the German hybrids stand out, specifically Porsches and BMWs. They do a significantly better job of separating out the propulsion system from all the disparate systems that impact driving dynamics. Steering, brakes, body control. And that translates to something that, yes, is moved forward through electric thrust, but in reality still keeps to the mission of being a sports sedan. You're gonna look at me like I'm nuts, but I will go so far as to saying that this is almost a legitimate substitute for the 6-cylinder flavor of the 5 Series. Now, why do I say almost? Well, we learned it's got the power of a 6-cylinder, but not the silky, smooth power delivery of a Freude am Fahren 6-cylinder. And say what you want about BMW design nowadays, they still make some of the best inline sixes in the business. Which brings us to the wish list. And here, you kind of know where I'm going, but I'm going to throw you a curveball because there's two directions here. First and foremost, why the hell is the 48-volt system only on the 6-cylinder, not on the 4 or not on the 8? Think of the application of a mild hybrid in both of those directions, especially for the 8-cylinder with instantaneous torque and improved reliability. That would be wunderbar. But when it comes to the scope of the wish list for this specific flavor of 5 Series, that's where I'd love to reconcile the 48-volt architecture for both the car and the suspension with a parallel hybrid that has some EV driving range. Now, full honesty, I do not know if that is possible at a realistic price point today. So, in absence of that, 21 miles of range? Really? In an almost $71,000 car? What, 11 years ago, the Volt had 35 miles of range, and that car was, what, 30 grand? Now, I understand. This system, it's mainly to get around weirdo tax schemes and congestion charging in places like Europe, but let's have a wider stance on this. Let's try to make it more usable. Like, I'm a weirdo that could use 20 miles of range for a commute and be fine, but more people would need like 80, maybe 100 miles of range in something that is a parallel hybrid. And this is where I turn it around to you to opine in the comments below or via our social media, MotoManTV all one word, MotoManTV all one word, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, to see what else we should be adding to this wish list, or if we should just go with a 48-volt V8 and call it a day. Until I see you in the next episode, bis später.